Hey there. Good morning, everyone. I know more folks will be wandering in, but as people that come to my meetings know, I have this kind of weird thing that I like to start on time, because you all should be rewarded, right? You got up on a Friday. Metro was pretty empty this morning, so I was kind of worried. I thought, oh, everyone's going to sleep in. And so, yeah, my name is Jennifer Turner. Most of you know me, but yeah, let me tell you what. I direct the China Environment Forum here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Been hanging around this town for 11 years in the same job. Here. One of 20 projects and programs here, and like all of them, we focus on foreign policy issues in the spirit of Woodrow Wilson. We try to bring the policy and scholarly communities together. China Environment Forum, we focus very much on energy and environmental issues in China, working with NGOs, business, researchers, government folks. And today, we can add a new category, climate experts, global climate negotiation experts. Those of you that come to meetings regularly over the past year know that about a year ago, the Blue Moon Fund and Rockefeller Brother Fund gave us a grant to create a project called Cooperative Competitors. And then our USAID Vermont Law School grant helps support it as well, where we're trying to look at how and why the U.S. and China can cooperate on energy and climate. And we've really been in the weeds for most this year, looking on kind of the green revolution kind of topics, the clean energy, the power sector cooperation, green jobs, are China stealing ours, blah, 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 and green transport. And there's that little thing called Cancun Global Climate Meeting coming up. So we thought that last month we started shifting a little bit back to climate-related meetings. Were any of you at our meeting on the glacier melt with those great photos with David Brashears last month? It was just fabulous. So we looked at, and we had a meeting with on MRV issues last month as well, looking more specifically not just U.S.-China relations, but what is MRV? I thought it was kind of, because I learned something at that meeting. Because it's like, oh, it's not, so we do try to get beyond the superficialities of things. So Cancun's coming, and so we're going to take a pulse on global climate negotiations today, which I am not an expert in, but I've got people who are. And Jake Schmidt, he kind of hangs his hat over at NRDC, directing international climate policy over there, 10 years experience hanging out in this field. And he's going to start us off with kind of broad brushstrokes of Copenhagen, Copenhagen to Cancun and beyond. There will be beyond, right, Jake?
There's always beyond.
There's always beyond. And the second speaker, let me get some water here so I stop. I got to make this comment at my last meeting that I have friends in town, good friends in town, all these people are my friends, but who I never see. Then I find if I invite them to speak at my meeting, then I get to see them. Because, everyone's really busy. Duncan Marsh, he's also the International Climate Policy Director at a different NGO, the Nature Conservancy. Used to work at UN Foundation, negotiator at the Department of State for Climate, hung out in the Beijing Embassy. But what's really important to know is that Duncan and I, both different places, were English teachers in Taiwan and are both spions. Anyone know what a spion is? No. Indiana University, School of Public and Environmental Affairs. He was smart and did a master's and kind of got out and was making money and having his life move forward. And I did a PhD, which of course means my life didn't move forward for a long time. So Duncan is going to talk, looking at the climate negotiations, but more through the U.S.-China lens of some of the problems, MRV, but not all problems, opportunities, right?
You forgot the most important thing.
What's the most important thing?
I recommended you for this job.
Oh, damn. Yes. He recommended me for this job.
It was a long time ago.
Yeah. It was 11 years. How do you expect me to remember that? That's right. He told me, hey, Jennifer, there's this place, the Wilson Center. They do this China thing. You should do this. That's right. 11 years. That's a long time.
It's my best legacy ever.
And then last but not least, that we have Michael Davidson, who's, and I think this is like a new position at NRDC, this kind of China climate fellow. About a year old, and so what I really like is that having more people in D.C. at these NGOs who do China, he's supporting their 30+ team in Beijing, but also kind of doing more meetings and things in D.C. on the U.S.-China climate and environmental sphere. He was a former Fulbright fellow, did renewable energy stuff, fluent in more languages than we want to really mention, but he's going to dive down even further into what China is specifically doing on MRV. these days, okay? And those of you that maybe got the first round of invites, you know that initially I'd invite, Tung Fei was supposed to come, but there was he got his visa, but there were other things. Any of you that do work with China know that happens. But he will be showing up in town next week, and I may put together a closed chat with him. So anyone who thinks you might like to talk to Tung Fei next week, just come talk to me afterwards. Okay, so are you ready? Get those PowerPoint slides up. They're going to talk no more than 20 minutes each. They're not going to overwhelm you with excessively long PowerPoints because they are smart people. And let's go. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and thanks everyone for coming on a Friday morning. As she mentioned, I'm Jake Schmidt. I'm the International Climate Policy Director at the Natural Resource Defense Council. And I'm going to give you a bit of the expectations going into Cancun, which scarily happens in just about a month. The end of November, beginning of December, countries will meet in Cancun to continue to move forward on international discussions on climate change. I'm going to give you a bit of sense, just kind of very quickly dive into what happened in Copenhagen. What did we get out of Copenhagen? What do we need to accomplish in Cancun? What are the expectations? And then I'm going to try to remind us of frankly, why we have these international climate discussions, because it's not just to travel to luxurious places and spend 2 weeks in a conference center eating their wonderful, disgusting sandwiches, but it's actually
there was Tianjin.
And there's Tianjin, which was a very nice complex, much better than normal. So I'll try to remind us why we go to these meetings. So Copenhagen was the last meeting in December of last year. 130 countries agreed to and have now, 130 plus countries have now signified that the Copenhagen Accord has some meaning for them as a political document. Means that the institutions reflected there and the agreements there are generally agreed by their countries, were signed off by their leaders and so forth. Let's not forget that coming into and coming out of Copenhagen, countries accounting for 80% of the world's emissions took specific commitments to reduce their global warming pollution. And that's a very significant shift from where we were going into Copenhagen. The Kyoto Protocol, for example, had commitments from about 40% of the world's emissions under emission reduction commitments. So that's a significant shift in both the thinking and the framework, as well as dealing with this critical challenge, because obviously we can't have a solution to global warming pollution that doesn't have all countries moving in the right direction. While Copenhagen wasn't formally agreed, it was recognized as a political declaration by key leaders and subsequently sort of signaled by these 130 plus countries. So as we've gone from Copenhagen to Cancun, the focus has been how do you take this political document and turn it into sort of a more formal agreement, and how do you add more details to some of the things that were captured in the Copenhagen Accord. There's key pieces of the Copenhagen Accord which frankly have a sentence or two which in some sense need a much more detailed explanation of how the international process is going to deal with them. Check.
You're being switched up.
Oh,
you broke it. No.
This one's the tapped for the outside audience. So let me start with the three things that we know for sure about Cancun. And there's a lot that we don't know because countries have come into Cancun with a bit of similar expectations, or at least how they talk about the expectations. But what we can actually accomplish in Cancun is a mystery even to the folks that follow this very closely, including myself. So the first thing we know, no treaty will be agreed in Cancun. We will be translating these Copenhagen Accord frameworks and some of the more detailed into what are called decisions, which in essence are the normal practice of how the climate negotiations captures a consensus document and a consensus framework for how to move forward. So these are not binding in any sort of legally sense, but they give sort of a political bindingness in the sense that countries agree to sort of conform to these sets of decisions. The focus is on achieving a balanced set of decisions. You'll hear that discussion quite a bit in the lead into Cancun. What that means to different countries means different things, but I'll give you some sense of what we think it means. The second thing that we know for sure, whatever's agreed on the details of each of these pieces won't be the final story on that. There's a clear sense that we'll agree to a number of the key elements of each of these issues, but we won't agree to the full package for each of these issues. So further work will have to come post-Cancun in any case. And the last thing that I think we generally know, and countries seem to generally know, is that we need to rebuild trust in the global process of dealing with this issue. There was a lot of mistrust that was built up in the lead-in to Copenhagen and during Copenhagen and subsequently, and so we need to seriously rebuild that trust. We also need to begin to implement concrete outcomes. We can't wait for the final treaty, the final deal to be done before we begin to deal with this issue. So we need to begin to take the steps that we can take now. And lastly, we need to lay the foundation for subsequent negotiations and subsequent meetings. In particular, the one that follows Cancun is the meeting in South Africa, the end of 2011. And then Rio plus 20 is being held in June of 2012, where we expect that will be probably the next time that the leaders of all the key countries will be sitting around the table at the same time to discuss environmental and climate issues. So that's kind of how we're heading into these discussions. So there's a lot of discussions about the details, but I think there's two critical things that Cancun needs to focus on in particular. And I have to say this 3 times, as we say in things: repeat, repeat, repeat. That's a key message for the press and others. Actions, actions, actions. The negotiating texts are critical. These paragraphs, the commas, are important in the sense of sending directions, but they're not the final story, right? If we had an international agreement that had all the right words, all the right commas, all the right paragraphs, but didn't have countries actually moving at home to reduce their emissions, it would be a bit of a meaningless document. So what we've got to do in Cancun is continue to build upon the expectation that countries will take action at home and will come to the international agreements and discuss how they're proceeding on that front. So we need countries looking at each other in the eyes and being able to say, I've done such and such towards my commitment that I made in Copenhagen. Further progress is coming. These are the kinds of laws we're putting in place. And continue to focus on what countries are doing at home and whether or not they're living up to their commitments, because that's central. This will probably start very informally in Cancun, but I think it needs to become more formal over time, and that's some of the pieces in terms of MRV that will be discussed later. The second sort of overarching piece that's a big narrative of Cancun is the prompt start funding. So in Copenhagen, countries committed to, developed countries committed to helping to mobilize $30 billion over the next 3 years, so between 2010 and 2012, to help developing countries deploy clean energy, reduce their deforestation emissions, and deal with the impacts of climate change that are being felt today and will be felt in the future. So Cancun needs to create the expectation that countries will not just make these grand pledges, and according to the World Resources Institute, the pledges that have been put on the table get you roughly towards that 30 billion. But the key credibility behind those pledges is whether or not that those pledges are turned into dollars, euros, and wons. So basically, are these turned into real cash and not just political commitments to deliver money? The second sort of important piece, and I think it's linked, is we need to create the expectation that not just we'll create huge sums of money, but that we'll actually effectively spend this money. And I think that that's both important for the environmental objective of making sure that this money is, helping to deploy renewables and energy efficiency and stopping deforestation and dealing with adaptation. But also, it's mutually reinforcing, because the more that we have positive stories about the impacts and the good things that this down payment of money will have on the ground, the more we'll be able to build the case for that much larger amount of money that we need in the future. And that was a political commitment by countries in Copenhagen to mobilize $100 billion per year by 2020. So if we can sort of tell the story about how we spent this $30 billion well, I think we'll be able to tell the story much more effectively of how we scale up that money. So with those kind of two overarching narratives, the two linchpins, in my view, and I think that this is shared by many people in many countries, are MRV and finance. So monitoring, reporting, verification, and the finance pieces. These are intricately linked because when the United States and to some extent Europe and Australia say we want a balanced package, they mean a balanced package which includes a continuation of the commitment that was made on the transparency, on the monitoring and reporting verification pieces in Copenhagen that they secured in the final days. And similarly, developing countries view willingness to move on that front as a signal that the developed countries have lived up to their commitments on finance to help move that issue forward as well. So they're intricately linked, and in order to get movement on these other detailed pieces, we need to have some resolution of these pieces in Cancun. So within the finance, the expectations, as I said, on each of these are not to resolve every issue, but I think the expectations for finance are to create a global fund for climate change, which will be somewhat mirrored on the global fund to combat malaria and AIDS, and sort of creating a multilateral framework to help deliver money for deforestation, clean energy, adaptation, and need to create some sense that there's a discussion going that will start to look at and help to build the case for the $100 billion per year. So I think today, the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on climate finance will release a report which will outline some options to how to scale up to $100 billion. The expectations are that people won't come to Cancun and say, we like that option or that option, but that they will create a process and a continued discussion for how they might evaluate and scale up some of these options over time. So within the monitoring, reporting, verification piece, and Duncan and Michael will give you a bit more detail on it, I think there's a two-part piece to that. Reaffirm / improve the way that developed countries report and monitor their emissions. Developed countries under the Framework Convention on Climate Change and those under the Kyoto Protocol have a set of rules for how they report their emissions, track their progress towards their commitments. There's some important holes and important clarification that needs to be further elaborated in a Cancun decision to provide confidence to the developing countries that developed countries aren't trying to sort of weasel out of difficult commitments and to find every loophole possible to not make their commitments real. The second piece, and Duncan and Michael will spend much more time on this, is we had in Copenhagen agreement to report developing country emissions and actions much more frequently, 2 years as opposed to right now, which is 15 years at best, 10 years if you're doing a good calendar. That was a significant improvement. There's a lot of the details and the need to formalize that that needs to be fleshed out in a decision in Cancun. And then so those are the kind of two linchpins. Now you hear a lot of people discussing, oh, we need to create the building blocks, let's agree to the building blocks. My sense is that you can't agree to the building blocks without agreeing to the key sort of political linchpins, which are finance and MRV, because those are two intertwined. The expectations are that we'll have a set of decisions. If we can agree to those two pieces, the MRV and the finance, we'll have a set of decisions on reducing emissions from deforestation, which frankly will not resolve every aspect of deforestation. It will set some parameters for how countries spend money. It will provide some safeguards in terms of biodiversity, indigenous rights, and I think importantly, hopefully will send some signals that countries have to deal with their drivers of deforestation, so the demand for wood products, the demand for soy, the demands for cattle, and so forth. Second is creating some frameworks around how we in the international community help countries deploy clean energy. So this is focused around creating, at this stage, a bit more of a organized function within the climate discussions for helping developing countries tap into resources that are out there for clean energy. Creating a set of centers and networks, sort of mirrored off of how the agricultural revolution set up these institutions throughout different regions of the country that are sort of experts on clean energy and can help be problem solvers to countries, so that when, say, Chad or South Africa is looking at its energy needs, it can go to some of these experts and say, well, what is the current cost of renewables and solar and energy efficiency? How do I build that into my electricity demand in the future? And the last piece is a decision around adaptation, which will create some institutional framework and send some signals for how countries will mobilize money towards dealing with the impacts of climate change on the ground. It'll set some parameters. It won't answer every set of issues around this, but it'll hopefully provide some framework for that. And then within each of these pieces, as I said, not everything will be finalized. So Cancun will need to chart sort of a course for how the issues that haven't been finalized are resolved in the future. What's the sort of work plan for the continued climate discussions leading into South Africa and into Rio? So one piece that I think is a big outstanding issue is whether or not countries will formalize their commitments made in Copenhagen. While we sense no walking back from any countries to actually do those steps at home, for example, there's no signs that China is saying, oh, we made that 40 to 45% commitment in Copenhagen, but we're not doing it, end of story. That was a Copenhagen thing. It was a moment where we were caught up in the darkness of Copenhagen. All signs are that China is continuing to move forward with that. It'll enshrine it in its next 5-year plan. Similar stories in places like Brazil, places like South Africa, Mexico, South Korea, and so forth. So the challenge is how countries sort of reflect these commitments into an international agreement, and the politics around that are dicey for a variety of reasons, which I'm happy to explain in questions, but it'll be very detailed. So let me just kind of wrap up with the final reminder of why do we have these international climate discussions? Is it because we like to look at legal text for many, many years? I think the answer is no. We create these international frameworks because we want to encourage countries to do stuff, to take steps to reduce their emissions, to take steps to deal with their adaptation, and so forth. And so one of the key things that we need to create is a mechanism for countries to take concrete action at home. We've seen, signs of both developed and developing countries coming forward with their commitments to reduce their emissions. Developed countries, to a large extent, have continued to move down that path. There's obviously a huge uncertainty about how the U.S. is going to move forward in reducing its emissions. Our sense, and I think that the Obama administration at least is signaling this, is that they need to continue to move with the existing tools that they have. And that includes moving on the EPA front, but it also includes moving on the Department of Energy front, Department of Ag front, and continuing to use existing tools that it can and defend against attacks to strip away the ability to do that. Obviously, that'll be a huge challenge given the current situation, but we think that there's a positive story that can be told there. The last is that major developing countries have continued to move forward. Some, to varying extents, have started to implement laws and policies and programs to meet their commitments. Others are beginning that discussion and are starting to create sort of more national dialogues about how they're going to implement a set of policies and measures to move forward. But the key sort of message that I want to leave people with is that while there's still a significant uncertainty about what the international agreement will look like, countries aren't waiting for the final agreement before they take action. We used to have this situation where you could honestly say everybody's waiting for the final deal before they do anything at home. I don't think that is actually the case anymore. Countries are moving despite the huge uncertainty about the international agreement. Obviously, they're calibrating their thinking about how to move forward on the basis of what they expect from the international agreement, but they're not sitting by and saying, oh, that climate change thing doesn't really exist. We're not going to have to deal with it. We're only going to deal with it because 194 countries tell us we have to deal with it. They're saying, we're going to deal with it. And so we've tried to continue to focus on what countries are doing, created a website, very simple, to try to track what countries are doing, provide some more detail on that. It's pretty small, so instead of squinting, maybe Jennifer will give you the slides, but it's very easy set of things to look at. And one key piece why I think it's important to remind ourselves that the international agreement is not the only reason why countries move forward is there's very strong domestic reasons why countries have taken action. Climate change is real. If you go spend any time in a developing country, you know that they feel the reality of that to some extent much greater than we in the U.S. and elsewhere. You know, we talk about these impacts. They're seeing these impacts on a daily basis and feeling them. Second is there's lots of kind of tangible co-benefits why moving on climate change is both good for domestic reasons, reduces your air pollution, reduces your security implications of having to import oil. It deals with creating jobs and some of those other sort of positive benefits. And the last piece, which I think is an important narrative that has played out over the last 6 months or year, is there's a real race for the clean energy future happening. So let me give you a little bit of detail because I think this is an important framework. According to IEA, there's a $13 trillion race for the clean energy future as the world moves to dealing with climate change over the next 2 decades. That is significant. $13 trillion. I know in D.C. if it's in the trillions, it actually becomes meaningful money. 13 trillion is a lot. It's much larger than the current IT market. It's much larger than many things out there. It's a significant market. The current story is that the race is happening. Some countries are leading in that race. According to data from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, which tracks deals, the European Union, if you count them as a single country, although they're not really a country, but they're leading it, $41 billion. China has taken up a huge share of that, $34.6 billion, and the U.S. went from being the leader in clean energy deployment just a year before to being behind China and significantly behind China. And we'll see what the numbers are for 2010, but it wouldn't shock me if the trends continue. So the race is happening. Those countries that tap into this will see the benefits, and I think that those countries that sit on the sidelines will wake up in 20 years and look for job and economic opportunities and won't be kind of leading that discussion. So let me just wrap up with the kind of 3 key take-home points, at least from my perspective. There's modest expectations for Cancun. We don't expect the final deal. The expectations, in some sense, going into Copenhagen were both unrealistic and unachievable. Countries have calibrated and have looked at the reality and are trying to move forward, hopefully move forward in a way that sends a signal that the UNFCCC continues in a credible way. Second piece, countries are still moving to take action at home. And that's an important storyline because going into Copenhagen, we basically had a formal world where the developed countries took action and the developing countries said, you keep taking action, we'll sit on the side. Well, that wasn't exactly true. That was kind of the broad narrative. And I think that the narrative now is that we're all going to move forward because we have to move forward. Obviously, developed countries are going to move forward in a slightly different way than developing countries, but we're all going to take concrete steps to reduce our emissions. And the last piece, which I think is important to remind ourselves, is this race for the clean energy future is real. It's happening. And if you don't tap into it, you'll miss the opportunities. So thank you very much. There's some contact stuff and some details, which I think Jennifer will provide slides on. So thank you.
Hey, let's thank this guy. Thank you. And we will post these in PDFs on our website. And if you can switch it out, and I'll hand the little remote so Duncan doesn't have to climb over you. Which could be interesting. And those of you that came in a little bit late, you can move up to the table. These guys think that no one likes them because you're not sitting close to them. I know they're scary. They're climate experts. Okay. Do you have the little remote?
I do, yes. Okay, is this on? No. That's on, right? Sure. Okay, good. Good morning, everybody. I'm Duncan Marsh, and thanks, Jake. As we're recording this, well, first of all, a couple of points. Jennifer's email the other day said Duncan Marsh is going to replace Tung Fei on the panel. And in a technical sense, that's right, but I'm definitely not replacing Professor Tung's role because he really is an expert on China's MRV matters, and I'm not at all. The title of my presentation that I gave it was "What's a Little MRV Among Friends?" And there's a couple of ironies in this title if you don't capture them all. But one of them is that I actually don't follow the intricacies of the MRV negotiations as much as some people, including Jake, is giving that a bit more attention than I am. Although coming from the Nature Conservancy, we devote a great deal of attention to MRV in the land use change and forestry sectors. But in terms of the details of the international negotiations, I do follow it to some degree, but not in as much detail as Jake, or perhaps even some of you in the room. But I will say that for the last 13 years or so, I do think that I've been a pretty close observer of the way the U.S. and China have negotiated on climate change, dating from when I was at the State Department and actually helped manage that relationship a little bit at the working level. So let's turn to a little bit of background on the U.S. and China, these two large countries. In terms of emissions trends, the U.S. is clearly the world's leader in historical emissions. China's not insignificant, though, even though it's been a developing country during much of this time. I don't know exactly where it stands on the rank of historical emitters, but it's not too far down that list, as you can imagine, by the size of the country, and also by the fact that a lot of the even though China was not industrializing at the rate of the countries in the West, it had a lot of emissions from the land use change and forestry sector over that time, largely due to agricultural expansion and deforestation and other drivers for the loss of the carbon in forests. In terms of future trends, China's growth is extremely significant. I think the IEA has estimated that China may occupy up to 1/2 of the world's emissions growth over the next several decades, which is obviously a figure that cannot be ignored as we think about how to make an international climate cooperation system work. And I think Michael will give a little more detail about China's specific actions to address its emissions, which in many cases, whether they're intentionally targeted exclusively as climate change policies or not, nevertheless have a very significant effect on reducing China's emissions, the rate of China's emissions growth. And China is to be applauded for the many aggressive actions it's taking in those areas. Nevertheless, the growth does continue. But one thing notable is China's interest in new tools, such as the use of carbon markets domestically. And its exploration and experimentation of those, and the rather explicit discussion of those, including in the next 5-year plan. So there are very interesting trends happening in China. Anybody who's been there in the last few years knows of the dynamism that Jake just described in terms of investment in clean energy. It's impressive and exciting, and you can't help but be somewhat captivated by it when you're there. Politically, the two countries have very different political structures, of course, and yet I would argue that some of the forces shaping their positions in some ways are not that different. Obviously, large industrial sectors, which have significant influence over the politics. Probably in China, those haven't even begun to fully weigh into the Chinese position. But if the government did get even more aggressive in terms of seeking emissions caps, we might even see more push from China's oil and gas sector and other industrial forces. And then just a word on negotiating approaches of the two countries. China, of course, is a member of and a leader of the G77 plus China, which is a developing country bloc of nations. The U.S. is a leading member of the Umbrella Group, which is a somewhat loose alliance of countries that are developed countries that are not part of the EU, and have a number of them have a fair amount in common. The U.S. And Australia and New Zealand and Canada probably being some of the most prominent, but it also includes Russia and Ukraine. So there's a somewhat diversity there. And in terms of style in the negotiations, I think that my observation is that the Chinese delegation remains somewhat insular in their style. I think that they are I would say the Chinese negotiating approach has not yet expanded to the sense of actively seeking a global agreement by managing the interests of multiple and diverse countries and blocs from around the world. I think they're still looking at it in a bit of a sort of defensive and protective approach. Now, every country protects its own interests, including the U.S. There's no question about that. As it's been said, all countries' interests are narrow, and some countries' interests are narrower than others. So both countries are protecting interests, but I do think that China, in terms of climate change negotiations, has not yet grown into an approach that really seeks to mobilize different interests in countries around the world into what could constitute a global agreement. And I think the U.S. has more of that sort of mindset, has done so for some time, but obviously is very constrained by our domestic policy situation in our ability to leverage that sort of agreement. So those are just some observations on the overall dynamics between the two countries. I won't spend much time on this slide, but this is the progression of the evolution of the international climate policy regime over the last 18 years, and I will note that as Jake did prior to Copenhagen, there was pretty much a differentiation that was shaped in Kyoto and even before Kyoto in 1995 at the first COP, where the burden was on developed countries to act, and developing countries didn't have a significant burden to take actions to reduce emissions. There were some provisions calling for voluntary actions, but nothing of a binding nature at all. In Kyoto, of course, that such binding targets were applied to the developed countries, but the U.S. then chose to withdraw from Kyoto, and that pretty much lasted up until Bali. And I'll talk a little bit more about what happened in Bali later in the presentation. So, in terms of looking at what happened in Copenhagen, there was a 2-year process. Let's see. What I'm trying to do here is go through this and evaluate how much detail I need to give, given what Jake just did. So bear with me for a moment. So I will move right on through there and give you a visual perspective of Copenhagen. This is the people actually that were waiting outside the conference hall for 9 hours. Jake is right over here someplace, I think. The tall guy. Oh, were you? I see. You bribes to work then, huh? So some reflections on Copenhagen that we hope will not be repeated in Cancun, and I think the Mexicans and the UN Secretariat have done a very significant job in trying to avoid these this year. But there's clearly a poor organization reflected in the picture that you just saw outside the conference hall. But that was also reflected in many other ways in the conference. It was too big. There were many more people than probably should have been allowed into the conference hall, and it just became very difficult to manage logistically, which had an effect on the negotiations in a number of ways. I think it also related to that. I think it featured a greater a greater and more rapid dissemination of information than I've ever witnessed in an international negotiating situation, and may have been true for any negotiation in history. I'm not sure, but in the final days of the negotiation, this was true for all the 2 weeks, but including in the final crucial days and hours of the negotiation, a new text would be introduced in the very small closed group upstairs, and within half an hour, everybody in the conference hall had it. And the effect that has on negotiators who are trying to seek flexibility and be creative in trying to reach an agreement is really quite limiting, because suddenly public pressure comes upon them to not make concessions that they might have been able to otherwise, which in turn would have gotten concessions from the parties they're negotiating with. So the effect of this on Copenhagen should not be ignored. And it was partly due, by the way, to technology. The fact that people now are on Twitter and could tweet what was being said in the rooms, and people would know it within 2 minutes or less of what was being said. Or the fact that a document could be taken out of the room, scanned, and distributed over an email list to people in Singapore or anywhere else around the world within 10 minutes really changed things in ways that we haven't seen before. Then we had the pluralization of power. There were many more countries wielding influence in these negotiations than has typically been the case in climate change. Certainly was not the case in Kyoto or before. And we saw these in the final hours, in fact, when some smaller countries had really a limiting influence on the ability of to adopt the Copenhagen Accord, which many leaders had agreed to upstairs just hours before. So the UN process, the UNFCCC, did not officially adopt the Copenhagen Accord. Then, as part of that influence of more countries, some of the developing country blocs fractured. So the G77 plus China was no longer able to negotiate on all issues as a unified bloc. The small island states and the vulnerable countries were insisting on a role and a voice to overcome the voices that tend to dominate the 77, which are Saudi Arabia, China, India, and others. So the smaller countries don't feel always serve their interests. And then, of course, we had the constraints on the U.S. And nevertheless, and this is something that Jake said, we had the highest level of political attention ever given to the issue. And that the momentum from that still continues today. And Jake talked a lot about action. And I very much agree with what he said. In fact, in this year of 2010, I think following the debacle in Copenhagen, and I say debacle carefully because in many ways it was for the formal negotiations, and yet a Copenhagen Accord was pulled out of that exercise, which had meaning and had some breakthrough agreements that have put us on a new path. Nevertheless, as Jake said, the trust in the negotiating process has really been undermined, and the pathway toward a clear and binding agreement is not obvious right now. So I consider us now to be in a year of implementation, both of the pledges made in Copenhagen and of just the general momentum and political interest that was generated through the course of last year, and also of institution building. And eventually, by building institutions domestically and internationally at multiple levels, we are likely to create a stronger foundation for climate action and for an international binding agreement over time, but it will take time. So, at the risk of putting a lot of text on the screen, I thought I'd talk a little bit about what the MRV issues are. MRV referring to measurement, reporting, and verification. And as Jake said, it really equates to transparency, the understanding of what each country is doing to address climate change, and both in terms of mitigation and in terms of supporting efforts in other countries. In the case of developed countries, obligations to provide financial and technical support to developing countries. So, as I said, there's too much text on here. I apologize for that, but I actually edited out quite a bit of the text, and let me ask, is this large enough so that people in the back of the room can read it? Okay.
Yeah, it's Duncan, the eye doctor.
Yeah, okay. Being 47 years old, my guess is the people under 35 or 40 probably can read it, and the others may have some more difficulty. But I'll walk through some of this. So this is the Bali Action Plan with its two famous paragraphs, 1B1 and 1B2, which are under the mitigation section of the agreement negotiated in Bali in 2007. The first one is on developed country mitigation actions, and you'll see measurable, reportable, and verifiable. Wait, I'm sorry, do I have the right? Yep. And verifiable nationally appropriate mitigation commitments or actions, including quantified emissions limitation and reduction objectives by all developed country parties. And for the developing country, paragraph 2, nationally appropriate mitigation actions, known as NAMAs in the parlance, by developing country parties in the context of sustainable development, supported and enabled by technology, financing, and capacity building in a measurable, reportable, and verifiable manner. This right here is the famous comma. And interestingly, over the last the final day in Bali featured a debate over the placement of these three words: measurable, reportable, and verifiable. And the U.S. wanted symmetry between the two paragraphs. They wanted these three words right there at the beginning of the paragraph, just like in the one above. And the developing countries, the G77, fought bitterly against that. And eventually, at the end of the day, if you all remember, in a very dramatic compromise, the U.S. agreed to this compromise. And the consequence of that was, well, what does this mean, actually? What is actually measurable, reportable, and verifiable? Is it the actions or the technology, financing, and capacity building? Well, over the following year, this appeared in various different interpretations appeared. I think it's been really encouraging to me over the last 2 years to find that the resolution of this, for the most part, is that it applies to both the actions and the support coming from developed countries, which was the intention. And really, going back to the whole transparency thing is important, especially as the total emissions between the different countries and the different groups have grown more similar over the last couple decades. Then we have the Copenhagen Accord on MRV for Annex 1. This is the Annex 1, the developed countries paragraph. And it essentially says delivery of reductions in financing here by developed countries will be measured, reported, and verified. So this is clear, a consistency with the Bali Action Plan. I won't go into more detail on this paragraph because the more compelling one is really the next paragraph 5, which applies to the developing country parties, the non-Annex 1 parties. And here I've divided this into 2 long slides of text, but the key thing is that it says mitigation actions by non-Annex 1 parties shall be communicated through national communications, as Jake said, every 2 years. This was a very significant development, that every 2 years. And it's notable that they'll be communicated through national communications, which is a formal reporting to the UNFCCC process. And for developed countries, there was a mandate to do this regularly, but for developing countries, there never really was. It was simply periodic, if I recall, and they could decide what the period meant. So the other thing I'll note is that least developed countries and small island states may undertake actions voluntarily and on the basis of support. So they were granted a little bit more flexibility in how they addressed mitigation. And then in paragraph 5, here it says, and by the way, this is a horribly written paragraph. It's redundant. You will see inconsistency between national communications, which sometimes are capitalized and sometimes are not. This is all a reflection that because it was never adopted by the UN process itself, the Secretariat of the UN was not able to come in and clean up the language afterwards and have it make sense. So it really was what was agreed to in a back room upstairs, and with different inputs from different countries and all.
Any crazy comma stuff going on in this one?
and led, by the way, to some of the different interpretations of what it meant as a result. So here, the key thing here is that they will communicate information of their actions with provisions for international consultations and analysis. This is what Jake referred to, under clearly defined guidelines. Okay, the guidelines Jake also referred to. We need to develop guidelines or a process to define guidelines for this, and that, I think, needs to be one of the agreements in Cancun, that there does need to be some process to do this. And this has not gotten universal support from everybody this year. So then, and then we see actions seeking international support will be subject to international measurement, reporting, and verification. So here it's more stringent than international consultation and analysis. All right, so I'm sorry to take you through that level of detail on this, but it is sort of the root of what's been under much of the negotiation, and Michael will talk a little bit more about that. So a couple of observations that, Jennifer, do I have a few more minutes? Okay, great. Looking back at Copenhagen again, the U.S.-China relationship is the most important climate change relationship in the world by far. But it's not just the U.S. and China. There's many other actors involved, and as a result, it's a complicated negotiation. It's complicated just between the U.S. and China, but it's much more complicated than that and multidimensional. I think it's really critical that we continue to capitalize on the momentum, the political momentum that was generated last year. And there is some risk that that if the negotiations go badly, especially if we see a collapse again in Cancun, that momentum domestically even can be threatened in some countries by countries. Again, as Jake talked a lot about trust, not trusting what others are doing, and as a result, their domestic constituencies losing some support for climate action, and that would be the greatest tragedy that could befall the process going forward. There's a lot of questioning of the multilateral process itself, and the high expectations going into Copenhagen actually created for a greater letdown than would have been the case otherwise, and ratcheted up the pressure in Copenhagen and made it more difficult to get an agreement. So I think measuring the expectations appropriately to the circumstances, as Jake described, is going to be key in Cancun to allowing us to come out of there with some success. And then I will say, as far back to the U.S.-China relationship, climate change is but one of many issues the U.S. and China discuss. And the negotiations this year happen to be happening during a period of somewhat increased tensions between the two countries. So that, in turn, does bleed into the climate change negotiations and makes it somewhat more difficult. And you cannot view it independently of the broader relationship. On this issue of MRV, which the U.S. has given so much attention to, I think that and that China has dug in its heels on in many respects, and clearly they are articulating different interpretations of the Copenhagen Accord. I think that we would be much better off, and I think, Jake, you alluded to this too, if we tone down the rhetoric a little bit and recognize that for every country, they are dealing with challenges of MRV, of their emissions, in one way or another. And in the U.S., for instance, if we were to try to assess some of the emissions reducing outcomes of the many good initiatives that the Obama administration has taken on climate change and tried to disaggregate those, we would have a difficult time assigning how much emissions reductions to credit to any one initiative. And that's going to be true for any country. Now, in the U.S., we do have a national inventory that's of a pretty reliable nature to back that up. But not all countries have those systems in place. In China, there's, and Michael will talk about this, but in a sense, MRV is front page news in China. But it's not necessarily of carbon, it's of energy efficiency. And each province has targets, and they're trying to meet those targets. And whether they do or not, it gets on the front page, and it's the central government's way of applying pressure to the provinces. So that the point is that China is trying to build MRV systems itself. They may not be necessarily in the name of carbon in all cases, but nevertheless, the sort of things that they're reporting on are pretty similar. And in a sense, I think China needs more time to invest in its MRV systems. I don't think it will take that long, but I think it needs a little more time to have confidence to fully reflect that into the international process. At the same time, I don't see the U.S. as being in a position to act and move toward a legally binding agreement in the next few years. So in a sense, I would say the U.S. can use some more time, too, to build up its systems of a different nature, of a political support nature. And that would suggest to me that toning down the rhetoric is probably going to lead us to better outcomes on MRV and trying to work together in a collaborative fashion to help each other build the systems that we need for transparency, rather than trying to do it in a very legalistic way in the negotiations context. So I would like to see a process moving forward out of Copenhagen, but I think we need to be realistic about the expectations for agreement in Cancun on this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think the rhetoric. What was that? Yeah, I mean, in Tianjin, there was some scary sounding talk about kind of pigs looking in mirrors and zhuge liang. And if any of you missed that one, I can send you the link about some name calling that was happening.
Yes,
all right.
Indeed.
Yes, indeed. And so we got Michael here to tap in a little bit deeper on what China is doing on their domestic and international transparency. We've had bits of it, but I think this is going to be a bit more comprehensive than we had in the past. So go for it.
All right. Thank you, Jennifer. It's actually really great to be back here and give a little back to the forum that I've actually received so much from sitting in your seats before. So it's a pleasure to be here and speak about get in a little more detail of some MRV, both domestically and internationally in China, some of the systems that are in place, and how we can see those being internationalized and what China's positions are in international negotiations regarding these. So I'm Michael Davidson. I'm at the Natural Resource Defense Council. I think we have a brief slide. Oh, we do not, but whatever. You know organization. So here's a brief outline. And here is sort of the broad process. I apologize, the text might be a little small, but you'll get the slides online later. This basically sums up all of the data reporting, the issues that are substantive to the climate negotiations. And so that starts from implementing NAMAs to reporting those, national communications, and the ICA, which is agreed to in Copenhagen. And what I will talk about, two aspects of this. First one is that top right-hand corner, so the implementation of NAMAs, which is basically what is China doing domestically? What is it doing to fight greenhouse gas emissions on its own terms? And so here is a brief slide courtesy of Teng Fei, who could not be here, so I stole one of his slides. Just basically analyzing how the Chinese government lays out these different plans. So you have these broad 5-year plans, which are set by the State Council and approved by the NPC, and we're expecting the 12th 5-year plan to be approved in March. You also have, as you're going down, you have sort of implementations of those plans, you have national level programs, and then you have how it filtered down to the local and provincial levels. And here is a brief slide that I'm sure everyone already knows what China is already committed to doing, but I'll just remind everybody the energy efficiency target in the 11th 5-year plan, which is ending this year, 20% reduction in energy intensity, which is energy consumption per unit GDP by the end of this year. And as of last year, they had about 16%. And this year, obviously, there was a lot of press about energy intensity doing basically about face and increasing. Because of stimulus programs and other reasons, and so there's been a dramatic push to reverse that. And famous Wen Jiabao's Iron Fist speech of May, I suggest you read it if you haven't. Basically, bringing this all to the forefront, that this is a serious issue that Chinese leaders are approaching. This is not a run-of-the-mill target. It's not something that they just say and don't follow through with. This is something that they're very serious about, and a lot of provinces and localities are quite nervous about this. Hence, you hear about these blackouts and other very extreme measures about different governments trying to meet this target. They would only do that if there was extreme pressure from the central government. So just like to emphasize that. The other target, which was agreed to prior to Copenhagen, which is the carbon intensity reduction target, which is 40 to 45% by 2020. And we just heard the draft proposal from the 12th 5-year plan from the CBC Central Committee said that carbon intensity would also be a binding target in the 12th 5-year plan. So we expect that to be incorporated and under the same target responsibility system the energy intensity target currently enjoys. And a few other things in the 12th 5-year plan, but I will talk about that later. The next slide, just talking about international pledges. So there's the carbon intensity target, 2 other targets China made at Copenhagen, lest people forget. We have non-fossil energy use increasing to around 15% by 2020. Those two go hand in hand. So carbon intensity is a function of energy intensity reductions, a function of non-fossil fuel reductions, and other restructuring of economies. So there's all of those key factors that go into reducing China's overall carbon emissions, and then forest coverage. And we did a report on that. You can find it online. I put the address here on just what does a 40 to 45% carbon intensity reduction mean? Like, what does that how do you intensity of carbon? I mean, we know what CO2 emissions are. We know what energy use is, but sort of how fitting that into other international scenarios and what China will actually need to do to accomplish that target. And it is non-trivial to accomplish that target. So the next part will be focusing on sort of MRV systems, the domestic MRV systems. Now, the main driver behind this is the target responsibility system in China. So the 11th 5-year plan included the three binding targets, but there are two classes. One would be under the energy intensity reductions, and also the sort of criteria pollutants emissions reductions, SO2 and COD. Now, they both implement virtually the same target responsibility system, and I'll get in a little detail about what exactly that entails right here. So we have, this is the basic rubric, and I apologize if it's fairly small, but I'll just sort of summarize it. You have a 100-point system. 40 points of that are basically gauging if it met the target or not. This is for provinces, if it met the target or not. And the other 60 points are for specific energy-saving measures. So these are, in addition to actually meeting the target, you need to implement you need to prove that you implemented other aspects of energy savings. And the emissions reductions is very similar. It's the same 40-60 breakdown. Of course, there are different programs in place there. But
so the 40, it's the 60 is like institutions that they're creating to make sure that it really happens.
Yeah, there's other capacity building and other measures that they take in addition to just the flat target. But you notice I call that with veto, and so some people, some commentators have said that, well, this means that Chinese provinces could not meet their energy saving target, implement energy saving measures, and still get into the completed angle. For example, if they got 30 on the energy savings and then got 50 on the measures that they implemented, then they would be technically completed, wancheng. But that's not actually true, that if they did not meet the energy intensity target, that served as a veto, and they would therefore not have completed their task. Now, the reason that they break it down like that is they like to rank the provinces. They like to show which provinces are doing better than worse. It's not so much as to say that not all provinces need to meet the targets. It's just that you need to know which ones are doing the worst, so to focus your energies. And here, just as an example, this is not translated into English on the NDRC website, but I put some little guiders there for you. This was as of July 2010, which provinces are critical. And so they have three different categories, and they're all very small, but essentially the first category, which have the red circles, are serious condition, and then you have varying degrees, and green circles are okay. So the ones that I translated there are the provinces that are in critical condition as of July. So this is going through January to July and meeting their energy intensity reduction targets for 2010. So this is all public information. This is used as obviously a lever on these provinces in order to do better and to make sure that they complete their targets by the end of this year.
And they're the ones that are turning out their lights.
Yes.
We're saving energy. We turn off all the power.
Yeah. So here is a little background on how within the target responsibility system there is a provision for verifying. This is done. I'll just give a sort of brief discussion of how the emissions reductions targets versus the energy intensity reduction targets actually differ in this respect. So the emissions reductions targets are basically led by MEP. So it's the Ministry of Environmental Protection. They have a very robust system in place full of on-site visits and pre and post review and a variety of other factors getting into that. And MPP has these regional supervision centers which cover several provinces which again organize this. Energy savings, on the other hand, is done by a lot of different organizations within China. So NDRC takes the lead when they go down and do the on-site inspections, but there are a number of other agencies that are involved. I have a slew of acronyms, and I put a little notes on the bottom. You can read them later. But there are so many ministries involved there that you can imagine this is quite a complicated process. And in addition to that, you have the energy intensity figures, which are published and compiled by NBS, National Bureau of Statistics, go through an internal review process with an NBS. They're not subject to an external review. So this is a key sort of figure in how the energy emissions reductions targets are being verified and how the energy intensity reductions are being verified. Having said that, in the lead up to Tianjin, we had Minister Xie Zhenhua making very good statements about how increasing transparency of China's climate actions is something that China is willing to agree to, that its MRV is not a problem. Su Wei said that as well. There have been a lot of positive statements about how China is willing to become more transparent in how it publishes these target responsibility systems and other measures of meeting its climate commitments. And there are a couple reasons that we think why China is acting. I put them up there. One is that obviously China is making ambitious commitments, and let there be no doubt they're making ambitious commitments, and they want to get credit for that. And if they can't show to an international audience, hold up to international scrutiny that they are making those commitments, then they're not receiving all of the credit that they deserve. And this is very plain and simple. This is one of the reasons why they're acting on that. A couple other reasons would be they have as much stake in enhancing the international system as the U.S. does, and by increasing information transparency, this by definition enhances international systems. And China is making fronts on other sort of conventional areas. We've done a project on environmental information transparency indexes, and this is basically saying how transparent different local EPBs are in publishing their data. And so China is making great strides in this on all fronts, and this is one aspect which this is no different. And lastly, China is trying to position itself as a leader in low-carbon development, not only in clean energy technologies, but in eco-cities, low-carbon development zones, and other forms of green development. And by presenting their models to the international arena, they are then a model for developing countries and can then enhance their leadership status in the international arena. Briefly, the proposal for people who didn't see that was just published or just came out last week on what we expect in the 12th five-year plan. Again, this will be approved finally in next March. So right now this is just a draft proposal, but it's likely that most of these things will be incorporated in there. Energy and carbon intensity targets will be binding targets. The binding target is quite significant because it locks in this target responsibility system where people's jobs are on the line if they don't meet the target, as opposed to another form where they say we want to reduce so much. And in addition to those binding targets, there is also some backup measures. There is emphasis outside of just setting the targets, and this is very critical. As we saw in the 10th five-year plan, there was also a commitment to reduce SO2 emissions, but we noticed in the 10th five-year plan they actually increased dramatically, almost 30%. Now, why was that? Well, there was a commitment to reduce those emissions, but there wasn't the backup measures. There wasn't a statement of how they're going to reduce those emissions. There wasn't sort of the follow through, and there wasn't any bindiness in the end. There wasn't any responsibility that would have to be shouldered by the different provinces for not meeting it. And now we're seeing that in this five-year plan, they met the SO2 target already. This was largely because they had a variety of very active measures in order to meet those targets, in addition to just saying they want to meet the targets. So some of those would be, again, traditional energy efficiency measures. That continues to be the bedrock of all of these energy intensity reductions in China. You have obviously a focus on reducing the share of energy-intensive industries, what is called economic restructuring, and this, again, will play prominently in the next five-year plan. There was also a lot of discussion on market mechanisms, which could include environmental tax and most likely will include pilot discussions about cap-and-trade systems. And one of the most interesting things was the strategic industries, new strategic industries that were mentioned. There are 7 strategic industries that are mentioned in this draft proposal. Three of those 7 directly relate to energy efficiency, renewable energy, and several of the others indirectly relate to them. So there is definitely a large focus on enhancing the low-carbon development industries.
Can you say what are some of those industries, like wind or?
Oh, well, they say broadly there's clean energy, there's new energy vehicles, there's new materials, and energy efficiency, environmental protection, those sort of broad statements. Those will get fleshed out in the coming months, but
yeah, we'll try to post the English. I didn't have a chance to read it yet. I think it's been some people translate into English, so we'll get that up on the website too.
Yeah, we can send you some stuff.
Oh, good. I'd appreciate that.
Again, this target responsibility system again plays prominently into the 12th five-year plan. Now, and as we're seeing energy intensity argument become very heated in China currently, there's obviously been talk about revamping that or modifying it to ensure that the targets are met ahead of time, or at least on schedule. And so there was a note on how they want to increase data reporting, data management services, and the overall target responsibility system. And just as a side note, an official 2 weeks ago mentioned that the energy intensity target may be on the order of 17% for the two next 5-year plans, so 12th and 13th. This isn't official yet, but it's in line with what we expect between a 15 and 20% energy intensity reduction over the next 5-year plan. And those reductions, if they were to follow through, would be consistent, if not exceeding the current carbon intensity reductions as committed to in Copenhagen. And we have some analysis on that if you're interested in that. So finally wrapping up, just to emphasize, China is making very ambitious commitments to combat climate change domestically. They're doing this in addition to the obvious climate change reasons. It's actually Dr. Wheeler at Center for Global Development has a really interesting slide on how China is the most vulnerable country to climate change. I just had a presentation yesterday. I can forward you the slides, but it's acting for this sort of the traditional climate change and energy security reasons, but it's also acting for the reasons that I mentioned previously. It's also implementing a very robust domestic MRV system because it realizes that it needs to get its data management, it needs to get its energy intensity in check, and it's going to do that domestically regardless of what happens in international negotiations. However, as we're hearing from these statements from the climate negotiators prior to Tianjin and during Tianjin, that transparency is something that's on the table at their national negotiations. They're willing to discuss it. This is not going to be the last linchpin holding up the national negotiations. So this is something that we look forward to seeing how China is going to approach this in Cancun and what sort of announcements we expect that the second national communications will be done by then. We've heard some announcements to that effect, and just the Gordian knot can be solved. So thanks. I look forward to your questions.
Okay, well, thank you. To be honest, I wasn't sure if I was going to feel really happy after you guys talked, or optimistic, and I'm feeling happier. I'm feeling happier than I thought I would feel after this. Cushing, grab the microphone. Ask these people questions, and they can be difficult ones, and make sure that you say who you are, please.
Hi, I'm Steve Wolfson from the Environmental Protection Agency, Office General Counsel. And great presentations, great panel, Jennifer. Thanks a lot for putting this together. Having also been in China quite recently, a couple weeks ago, I agree that it's hard not to be impressed by what China's doing, both on clean energy and on environmental protection and building their institutions for environmental protection. I want to ask a question about one of the points in one of Michael's slides that mentioned the role of the Chinese Ministry of Environmental Protection's regional supervision centers, the RSCs, playing a big role in emissions reduction or in data verification. And I wanted to ask about that because what we had heard in the past about the regional supervision centers was that they were understaffed, under-resourced, and under-trained, and that they were they were ordered to respond to every complaint that comes in from the citizenry, including many complaints about things like noise from restaurants and things like that, from the people that live above the restaurant, and that they're just swamped by these complaints. And so there's, in my understanding, some lack of clarity as to their capacity to do other work besides responding to the complaints. I do think that it's going to be critical to be able to explain to people what China's MRV system looks like. And any system is only as strong as its weakest link. So I wanted to start off with kind of a tough question about the regional supervision centers and what role they're really in a position to play at this point on data verification or emissions data for emissions reduction. Thanks.
Well, thanks for your question. Yes, local EPBs are characteristically understaffed at all levels. That's nothing new in China. What we've found through some research on this topic specifically and how the emissions reductions targets are being met is that the regional supervision centers have the responsibility to organize the on-site inspections. And these are done, as I said, semi-annually. And they're also followed up with daily on-site inspections, and those are done through different officials. But the MEP has taken a very strong role in this, and the regional supervision centers have, by all accounts, been very successful in obviously ensuring that those criteria pollutant emissions are being reduced. So capacity issues are always a function when you talk about environmental protection in China. In that respect, this one has been given a little bit more oomph than other environmental issues. So that's sort of the short answer to your question. It's not obviously all of these issues aren't completely resolved. Energy intensity reduction targets are harder to meet than reducing SO2 emissions for a variety of reasons. But what we have seen is that having one strong agency behind it, in terms of the MEP and then the local regional supervision centers behind it, and organizing on-site inspections and taking responsibility for all of the localities within its jurisdiction and the enterprises, then it has been very successful in ensuring that those are met. Now, I can't really speak about the restaurant complaint, but they are traditionally understaffed, and there were complaints on both sides. There was some news about the local EPBs being too aggressive in going to monitor the emissions reductions, and some enterprises were complaining to that effect. And so they were sort of traditional complaints that we get here from enterprises at the EPA is too intrusive into our business. I mean, this is
you don't usually hear that in China.
Yeah. So this is quite new, actually. I guess it's promising that EPP is taking a much more aggressive role in ensuring these emissions reductions are taking place.
Yeah. A few weeks ago, we did have Jeremy Schweifels from EPA come and talk about the SO2, went into a lot of detail on difference between the 10th and 11th five-year plan and how there really has been success. And I think that's, and also seen in the upcoming 12th five-year plan, I think that is helping MEP, slowly start flexing their muscle. I have to say that I don't think that the regional centers are quite, they were designed, I think, to become more of a centralizing mechanism for MEP. I think it's still kind of an institution in waiting, but I think the whole climate stuff may kind of give it a little bit of a zing, but stay tuned.
And I'll jump in on on that a little bit to add some more detail to Michael's. I mean, I think if you legitimately, there's issues in terms of data collection issues and how they're doing it today. Our sense from lots of conversations subsequently after the climate negotiations, I think the technical level is working out these kinks, and we've seen lots of signs of improvement on things like air quality over time. So we did this, survey 2 years ago now, which sort of ranked cities according to air pollution and how transparent they were in reporting air pollution data. The fact that we could do that was earth-shattering at that point. And now we've done a second round of that, and it's become, it's become kind of a standard thing. And I think that we're seeing, an openness in terms of China's willingness to report provincial level energy intensity data, local level data, and I think that there is legitimate issues on the ground, and they have capacity building. They have, a lot of West Virginias. U.S. has lots of West Virginias as well in terms of how we collect data. But I think in some sense there is the ability to cross-check energy data. I mean, we're not physically, in the climate and energy world, we're not talking about the ability to hide power plants, right? We've got satellites, we can look at these things. We've got International Energy Agency data, which collects China's data and it provides us a platform, the Energy Information Administration. The U.S. has data, so there's other checks on the system besides what China does, and there is sort of local implementation issues which are a challenge, but there's that's not going to be the sort of final story of how data is going to be kind of checked against the system. So my sense is that in a couple of years' time, China will have built a pretty good system on the ground. I think there will still be some potential kinks in the system, as there is in the U.S. I mean, the U.S. is evolving its emissions inventory every day and every minute, and I think that we should expect the same thing in China, and that to the extent that we can create sort of dialogues to help unpack the detailed issues, I think there's a lot of opportunity to sort of further flesh out the details and help China kind of build a more robust system that I think that it really wants to do over time. And part of the challenge is that this has become very political between the two countries.
And well, you mentioned it briefly, but also because NRDC does the work on the open environmental information measures, that basically it's a Green Freedom of Information Act. Took us a while to get it going here, right? But that China really, they also allowed, I think it was Greenpeace and Ma Jun's group did a survey of how environmental protection bureaus were at actually releasing information. And, a similar thing that they could actually do that kind of study is significant.
That was actually our study with.
That was your study. I'm sorry. It was with Ma Jun. Sorry. They did something else with Greenpeace. Sorry. But basically, that's a huge trend I've seen over the last few years, is that you can actually go out and ask these kind of questions and come back from asking those kind of questions. Okay, some other questions out here. Open information. We've stunned them. Oh, here we go. He's got the mic coming up here.
Thanks. Good morning. My name is Scott Van Alstyne from the State Department. I work in the Office of International Visitors. You alluded to the greater interest or commitment or maybe even investment that China is putting into renewable energy resources, I think. And I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit more, because maybe we have something to learn from them.
Okay. You should have come to my presentation yesterday. I talked a little about that. But since this was talking about transparency, I didn't focus on that too much. But obviously, China is making great strides in renewable energy deployment, development, deployment, all aspects of it. They just released amendments last year to the renewable energy law, covering up some of the loopholes that were extant. So, for example, wind power not being connected to the grid. So they strengthened mandatory connection and power purchase policies. They've implemented, or they've said that they've put in the process of implementing technical standards for connecting to the grid. So, for example, making sure that wind turbines can accept low voltage, so that they don't there's not this big spike in the grid, and it becomes a burden, so that grid companies won't accept them. There are numerous policies being implemented in China, both at the central and provincial level, both wind, solar, biomass, all of those stuff. I mean, anything specific you're looking for?
Watching, can you hear me? Well, maybe a good follow-up question that I wasn't at yesterday's thing, obviously. So maybe about what impact their successes or interests in these fields has upon U.S.-China bilateral environmental negotiations.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's obviously the case that China's acting on climate change and being very aggressive and proactive in promoting its clean energy development, whereas in the U.S. we still struggle to have comprehensive energy and climate legislation. So this is something that we continue to emphasize with our Washington partners, that this is something the U.S. needs to correct. All the countries are acting, and the U.S. still doesn't have a energy policy per se. And that is something that is limiting in international negotiations. I think Jake could probably speak about how specifically domestic legislation in the U.S. affects, or the lack thereof affects, international negotiations. But it's definitely the case where the U.S. could learn many things from China, and vice versa. U.S. is doing stuff at the state level which could provide guidance to certain issues that China is facing. But I don't know, Jake.
I mean, that's been the question that's been by. I think you're kind of new to my forum here. We've been having different meetings, trying to dissect that issue about U.S.-China, and we're going to do probably a renewable meeting in December. But no, it's a tough question. But I think, Jake, you got.
Yeah, I mean, we've when President Obama went to China, he signed an agreement which set out some practical things that the two countries would do on energy, and mostly energy. I don't think there's renewables in there.
There's a renewable energy roadmap.
Yeah, I don't think there's much. I don't know what's behind that, but there's, despite this tensions that Duncan elaborated or hinted at, we've seen no slowing down of that cooperation. We're a partner in the new Green Buildings Energy Initiative with China and the U.S. Similarly, 2 out of the 3 the energy research centers that they've done have unfolded. And I think those are built upon trying to share lessons and frameworks going forward. I mean, to be completely honest, having spent, when I was in China, we took advantage of seeing some things, clean energy on the ground or low carbon energy on the ground, and doing the comparisons are difficult because, to be honest, we visited the Green Gen site, which is China's equivalent of Future Gen. We're still discussing where we're going to build that plant. China is building it as we speak, and folks that were there a year before had said it was just a hole in the ground, and now there's actually buildings and things popping up, and it's moving pretty fast. We visited a joint venture between a U.S. company and a Chinese battery company to produce electric vehicles, the Coalition plant, which is quite significant in the sense that they're actually going to build an electric vehicle and sell it in California next year and use Chinese batteries. The third place we visited an industrial plant, an old iron and steel plant in Shanghai, where they're taking the old iron and steel plant and turning it into a clean energy economic zone, going to dedicate $750 million to it. It's not in the billions, but it's a lot of money. And this is one of 12 that they're going to do throughout the country. I was sitting next to one of our energy efficiency experts, and we were trying to come up with an example of where the Chinese could go and visit a similar site throughout the world. We couldn't come up with one because there's no place in the world right now that's dedicating that amount of resources and on that level of scale to doing that. I think there's a lot of industrial plants in the Midwest in the U.S. that could use a retrofit, and there's some examples, but we don't have the same sort of political commitment and will to move that kind of resources and commitment. So I think there's a chance for cross-fertilization, but I think that anybody that's sitting in D.C. that's not looking at the facts on the ground and not looking at the data in terms of what China's doing on clean energy is deluding themselves to think that China's not doing anything. Now, is it completely perfect in China? No, because at the same time we were visiting these plants, the air quality in Beijing was the worst that our China program director had ever seen. So there's this twin tensions in China, but I think that we're seeing them move very seriously on a clean energy front that is taking form over the next couple of decades.
But generally, one thing that I've picked up, and you have too over the last, particularly 6 months, is that, before that it was the Chinese often complained that the U.S. government didn't acknowledge what they were doing. But now there's this new dialogue about how they're stealing our jobs, and it kind of seems like they can't win for losing. It's like, no, but so it's just, I don't know. It's kind of it's mystifying me a little bit.
We used to have this conversation in D.C., which was if only China would move on climate change and clean energy, then the U.S. could move. It still lingers, and frankly, it lingers, I think, only in policymakers that don't want to do anything on this front. The people that really want to do something are much more seeing the reality of China is moving on a clean energy and climate front. I mean, Bloomberg New Energy Finance is not a liberal environmental organization. They're he's shaking his head, but they actually track this data, and they're very credible and have a very sort of finance background and are respected by, very notable people, and that this data shows that China's investing in real clean energy.
We took them to the Hill, and we had a lot of staffers and people there, and they were really amazed by it. So who knows? Keep the dialogue going. Some other questions out there? Okay, in the back we got one here and one over there. The woman right here, closer, right there, but there she is.
Oh, thank you very much. Good morning. My name is Caitlin Soulard. I'm here representing myself. I just moved to D.C.
Welcome to D.C.
Oh, thank you. And I was wondering, I've really learned a lot from you guys about the different policies and different efforts that are being made. And I was just curious, what you thought India's role was in this situation as like a leader, and how cooperative they're being with China and the U.S. Because I know they're pretty high up there with their contribution so to the environment. So just curious what you guys thought about that.
Very good question. So India, just in terms of its emissions profile, has significantly lower per capita emissions than China and absolute emissions total in aggregate. Nevertheless, it shares some common characteristics: large developing country, very large population, and it, with China, is a member of a bloc of countries called the BASIC countries, which consists of Brazil, South Africa, India, and China. So those countries, they don't negotiate together, but they consult together both during and outside of the negotiations. And I gather that I believe they don't portray themselves as a negotiating bloc, but a consultation and information sharing and experience sharing bloc. But nevertheless, it's something that's emerged over the last year or so, and is a factor. So China and India, through that, and are coordinating to some degree. Interestingly, until about a year and a half ago, India was one of the hardest line developing countries on many of the north-south issues in the negotiations. And my observation is, over the last year, that's softened quite a bit. And the Environment Minister, Ramesh, has taken a more proactive and somewhat more progressive viewpoint towards some of the negotiating issues. And so the dynamics with India have improved, and my sense is they're playing somewhat of a leadership role in bringing the BASIC countries toward more constructive positions than had been the case 2 years ago, for instance. So that's my sense of where India is going. But that said, I should say, there have been tensions within the Indian government and delegation over these things, and I think it seems to me that Ramesh has appeared to be the winner of some of those internal tensions, but I don't know that they've completely gone away either.
I mean, just to add a couple of quick thoughts, it's a perfect timing question because as we speak, President Obama is probably, or he doesn't tell me his itinerary, but I think he's on a plane to go to Delhi for a series of discussions with Singh. As a part of that, we expect that there will be further commitments to implement clean energy commitments that the two made. When President Obama went to China, he subsequently went to India, I think a month after or a couple of weeks after, and signed a series of agreements with the Indians on that front. There's a lot moving forward. The U.S. is going to be scaling up its resources to help India move on clean energy fronts. There's a lot of opportunity there. The tensions between the U.S. and China are sort of real in terms of how they interact. The tensions are less there between India and the U.S. It's a much more of there's some atmospheric and there's some fireworks, but it's a much more softened. For example, India has been very open about the fact that it's going to report its data. As Ramesh says, we're a parliamentary system. I have to go before Congress basically and tell them what I'm doing. So of course I'm going to make that publicly available, where the Chinese have different historical reasons and different political system and therefore different resistance to the MRV issue than India. So India has, I think, been a bit more open to move. Ramesh has very significantly shifted the Indian position over the last couple of years very positively. He's taken some heat to that move internally, as Duncan alluded to, but he's managed to survive to date, and so I think the question is whether or not that positive sort of mood continues to shift, because in the past, India has historically been the one that has been mostly focusing on the north-south divide set of issues and trying to sort of drive as many issues between those. And Ramesh has sort of said, yes, those still exist, but there's legitimate reasons why India needs to move forward, and we're not going to stop moving forward. And they're building major solar and moving on energy efficiency and doing lots of things as well.
I mean, India wants to join that clean energy race.
They do. They have a set of 8 missions, I think it is 7 or 8 missions, I forget, and one of which is a major solar mission, which we've seen them moving forward with regulations and programs to incentivize renewables. It's a very significant renewables investment, that'll be scaled up.
Okay, good. I think we had another one at the very end there. There she is. Oh, no, I can't even see you. Yes, I just saw this little hand.
Hi, my name is Clara Salero from the Embassy of Venezuela.
Oh,
I would like to listen your comments about them. It's my understanding the negotiation is right now polarized. On one hand, we have a nation from the global north pushing for Copenhagen Accord agenda, and the other hand, we have the nation from the global south supporting this Cochabamba agreement. And I would like to hear your comment about what do you think about the many civil society movement from the global north are supporting right now the agenda of the Cochabamba agreement. What do you think about it? Thank you.
I think that's a Jake question.
Duncan's pointing at me. I don't think there's. I think there's this perception that there's a huge divide, and I think that unfortunately there, as anything, the divisions become more the story than the fact that people are willing to sort of move together. I think the reality coming into Cancun is that countries are going to have to decide, and that's a whole 194 countries are going to have to decide whether or not they want to continue to move forward, or if they want to, find every excuse not to find solutions to this issue. If we have a situation where the UNFCCC is perceived as not producing a tangible outcome, then I think that the reality is not that that leads us to correct it next year. What it leads to is countries finding alternative paths to move forward on this issue. And so, like anything in a 194 country negotiation, there's differences of opinion. I mean, you can't kid yourself that you come to an issue like climate change and have 194 countries agree to every piece. They don't. It's physically impossible, especially given their backgrounds. And so, the reality is, do you come to Cancun and say, we can agree to this, and these are the places that we can legitimately agree to, and recognize that there's issues that are not resolvable, that countries just have a difference of opinion on, and set those aside for the future and continue to move forward. Because I think that if we create a situation where we don't move forward on this issue, everybody suffers in the sense. And in some sense, the developing countries are going to suffer to the greater extent because the climate's going to hit them harder. I don't think the North will get off scotch-free by any such sense of the imagination. So we're all in this together, and we've got to find a way to overcome these differences, but not sort of create the barriers to moving forward on this issue in Cancun.
I wanted to follow up real quick. We've been talking about MRV, but I wondered if you can tell us a little bit more about the adaptation, what we might see, and like what's the U.S. position, what's the Chinese position on having. I mean, what does adaptation mean coming out of Cancun? Maybe is it that there's going to be developed countries support developing?
Yes. So, some portion of this $30 billion that's being spent now is going to adaptation. I think I've seen numbers which say 20%, 30% of that money is going to adaptation. What that means practically, to be frank, sometimes means doing development a bit smarter and better. So instead of investing in changing your crop patterns to deal with a drought, which is going to hit you every, say, 10 years. When you're looking at the climate realities of the next 50 years, that drought may hit you the next, every 2 years or every year. So the kinds of crop system that you might put in place would be very different than what you're doing. And so this is sort of taking a look at how you're going to do development and do it maybe slightly different in the context of moving forward. So the agreement, the expectations in Cancun will be that similarly for RED, it's not going to resolve everything, but it's going to set some parameters to how you're going to spend that money. It's going to try to create a focus on spending money in the most vulnerable countries. It's going to create some institutional structures to try to encourage that money is well spent and is being effectively delivered on the ground. But it won't honestly answer the difficult questions about how the money's shared. Who's the most vulnerable and who gets what, and is it are we going to focus on water versus food versus all these sets of issues, but it'll sort of create some positive momentum to move forward on the ground in key countries. But, no, it's good. Yeah.
May I address that too? A very good question, Jennifer. Adaptation needs to get dealt with for a whole lot of reasons. There's a significant number of the world's population that will be very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And as Jake said, everybody's going to be vulnerable to some degree. Some countries will have more resources to deal with it than others, which is a real challenge. And it relates, I think, in fact, to your question regarding Cochabamba and the sort of sense of the vulnerability of peoples from around the world to this issue. Many of them feel that they didn't have a lot to do with causing the issue in the first place. It's an important issue for humanity. It's also an important issue, though, in a political sense for the negotiations. And so it has to be dealt with. However, one of the challenges with adaptation, Jake described it well, that to a large extent it's about doing development smartly in the 21st century when we know that the climate is changing. However, we have to know what we're adapting to when you adapt. So we have the world has a challenge in terms of information about what the needs of adaptation are. And there's several overlays of information. One is to understand as best as we can what the anticipated impacts of climate change are on a fairly granular scale, regional basis. And then second, you have to overlay that onto where are the population centers. How are those populations likely to be affected? What are their options to deal with it in natural or man-made ways? And so we need a lot more information to shape the world's responses to adaptation. And partly because we don't have all this information, it's difficult for governments to commit a lot of funding to this, which is very frustrating to some of the developing countries, especially the small island states and least developed countries and others. So we're at a bit of a logjam with adaptation in terms of getting the sort of financial flows needed for this. Everybody knows we need them at a global scale, but they don't know how to direct them, where to direct them, or to what types of activities.
But does TNC and NRDC and WWF, do all you big dogs now have like adaptation specialists or looking at it?
Yes. We're devoting a lot of attention to the role the ecosystems play in helping human communities adapt to the impacts of climate change. So we're assessing this information at in China, for instance, we've just done a national assessment of the vulnerability of climate change that has helped the Ministry of Environmental Protection prioritize their priority conservation areas, and in each of those have adaptation strategies to adapt to anticipated climate impacts. That's more of a nature-focused exercise at this stage, but in China and other places we're expanding that into more looking at how it impacts human communities and what can be the role of ecosystems such as forests, wetlands, and mangrove forests and on coasts and other types of ecosystems in protecting human communities from the impacts. We actually believe that many of these will prove more cost-effective than building seawalls or dikes or these sorts of things, and much more sustainable and better for the communities in the long run.
Yeah. I have to do an adaptation meeting. Okay, we got Cushing, come up here, and then we'll bounce back to the back of the room. But this gentleman up front, I want to reward someone who sat close to the front here. Scary.
I paid for this microphone. No, I'm sorry. Thank you. I'm Bob Musil. I teach at American University on American environmental politics, and I know we're doing China. But in terms of I've just come back from Appalachia. I lecture at a lot of colleges and universities around the country. Everything you say about China is totally unknown to the American public, just to be blunt.
I have failed in my job here.
No. And I know how hard it is because the other side is hard, too.
You work inside the Beltway here.
So that's where I'm heading, given the disastrous results of the election from the perspective of climate, energy, etc. How will you get out the message that China is doing all this good stuff? All I ever hear about is how nasty they are and the pollution, etc., on the one hand. And how will we similarly work to convince people in the new Congress that we are losing a clean energy battle, that we're lagging? I joke on campuses that you will soon be driving Chinese electric cars, and I ask them who has tougher standards, China or Arnold's California, and they all get it wrong, right? So I guess the simple version is, what plans for communications, messaging, trying to position what you know, and I realize you're the folks who are really in the details, to get the American public to understand we're not having the old Kyoto debate from whenever, and that we're losing this race and we need to move on it. And any thoughts there?
Boy, yeah, I know.
You haven't failed either.
No, we have failed. We've partially succeeded. I mean, I took no offense by that. It's I think in some sense we've changed. I hear a lot less on Capitol Hill, or I did before, that China's not doing anything. So that in that sense we did, but I think you're right that the sort of reality of what when we got on the plane coming back from China, one of my colleagues has this great point, which was it wasn't like going from one country to another. It was like going from one century to another, and it wasn't going back in time. It was going forward in time, right? I don't think most Americans, beyond sort of a small segment, get that. They don't, and I don't know how to sort of break into that. I've kidded with the Chinese, which is every time you put up a wind turbine, make sure it says made in China and take a photo and send it to us, and we'll how do you physically show people the reality of what's going on? I mean, China, for example, has gone, in 2008, they were about 13% of the wind turbine production throughout the world. In 1 year, they doubled that. Their top three are now 26% of the world's wind turbine productions. In 1 year, doubling, is an astronomical shift in terms of this market, which is a relatively mature market, not fully mature. And so I think, but if you travel around the U.S. and I do to some extent, we have offices throughout the country. That kind of reality, as you said, doesn't sink in fully to people, and I don't know how to sort of fully break that in. We will be spending a lot of time trying.
I failed at my job. But
you failed at your job. We spend a lot of time to try to educate people. Sadly, I think the only way that we could fully help people understand that is to ship them all on a plane and go physically see in China.
That's a lot of carbon.
I don't think that's quite
the
I don't have the budget for that to do that. But I think that the more that people come back and credible voices that can talk about the reality in China, the more it will help to sort of sink in. But right now, the credible voices tend to be companies, CEOs of major multinational companies, which aren't very well respected in some of the hinterlands in the U.S., and sort of thought leaders. Tom Friedman, for example, has been very out there talking about this, but I don't know that in Midwest and West Virginia, Tom Friedman is really the sort of most respected voice, across the country. So,
they don't know who he is.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm a Midwesterner. I think you insulted me there. But what I've had some meetings. One thing is that I thought was interesting, this kind of newer trend of like U.S. Chinese companies coming together. We had Future Fuels, and they're using a technology, IGCC technology, and building a plant in Pennsylvania, creating like 350 jobs, right? And then and no one opposed it. At first I was kind of afraid that they wouldn't want to come and talk about it here in DC. But in some ways I think there is a time factor that because I'm getting more and more U.S. businesses saying to me, we Chinese have the technology, we want to bring it here. And the Chinese actually, it's funny, in some places like in Guangdong, it can be really expensive for companies, and they're finding South Carolina, it's cheaper. It's like kind of blow my mind there. But that, having more examples of that, that's one area. And there are a lot of us, I give talks all around the country, and I have this the jaws drop, huh? And, it's going to take a long time, but China is, I'm not going to psychoanalyze the U.S.-China relationship, but China is in this last campaign. It was used quite effectively as a campaign tool, and that's unfortunate. Even the clean energy stuff. Duncan,
Bob, I'm very glad you said that, because I was thinking as we talked up here about the progress that's been made, the moderate progress I would say that's been made in Washington and helping facilitate understanding of these things. has been good. But I had the same thoughts you did. How much is it really extending to the deeper parts of the country? And I think you've told us the truth. I do want to say that give credit to my colleagues and their organizations up here, because I think they've worked really hard at this, and a few other organizations have as well, the World Resources Institute being one of them. And we at the Nature Conservancy are I think we'll be devoting more resources to those communication challenges going forward. I also want to say in general that probably every environmental organization in the country right now is doing a review of its U.S. climate strategy. Certainly including us. And we're doing pretty extensive external reviews. Interviews of people to see what they think the needs are. But let me transform that a little bit to invite that to include all of you and any of you who have ideas on what the Nature Conservancy can be doing to increase understanding of climate change, to mobilize action and interest by people, to facilitate international understanding of it, including between the U.S. and China. Please write to me. I will disseminate it to my colleagues who also are working on this review with me, and we'd be happy to benefit from your views.
Thank you. Okay, Christine, right behind you.
I'm sorry, maybe I should say my email address again.
Yeah.
It's dmarsh@tnc.org. dmarsh@tnc.org.
And that's where you send all the Nigerian bank account.
Okay, there you go.
David Livingston from Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I was wondering, in the absence right now of a cap and trade bill or some kind of comprehensive climate policy here in the U.S., and with China increasingly waking up and looking to become a major player in clean energy industry and looking to participate in international climate agreements, I was wondering if you see a role for China's Sovereign Wealth Fund, China Investment Corporation, to maybe play a role in funneling some of that capital into U.S. markets or into U.S. or I guess clean energy development around the world, and if that's a potential arm for its climate diplomacy.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. I think that China's already making clean energy investments in Africa, for example. They don't. That story doesn't get out very actively, but they do. Often they're making investments in wind turbines and solar and some of this stuff. And when I talk to other countries, they say, well, we go to the World Bank. The World Bank talks to us about this, and then the Chinese are saying, well, don't worry about them. We'll come and we'll invest in your thing. So I think there is an active. I don't have concrete examples of exactly which arms of the Chinese, investment framework are doing that, but their export credit agency equivalent to our EXIM is very actively engaged in clean energy investments, around the world. It's just one of the steelworkers' complaints that they're overly active on that, but they are active in that. They have made some efforts to invest in the U.S. clean energy space. They've taken some political heat for doing that, but I would be surprised if they made major investments in the U.S. for the next couple of years because of that political backlash. But I don't think that they will sit on the sides and waiting to kind of use their own internal investments to be able to broaden it. They're taking these lessons and examples that they're doing and looking for the export markets, which are in Southeast Asia and in Africa and other places where China's got lots of investments on a whole bunch of different fronts.
One other, I mentioned the Future Fuels project, that even on the business side, when the U.S. and Chinese businesses come together, the Future Fuels folks said, yeah, we're doing it in Pennsylvania, and then we won't do it anymore in the States. We're going to go with our Chinese partner to Eastern Europe and Latin America because there's no market for it here. And realistically, it could also be political. He didn't say that, but I've kind of wondered myself, and I'm like, oh, another missed opportunity. Which is a pity. And we will be doing more on the ECAs in China soon. I think in January we got some. Yeah, I've been trying to look for experts on them. Very patient woman. Oh, yeah.
Sorry, just to that point, I don't know about the Sovereign Wealth Fund specifically, but I do know that China and U.S. companies are actively seeking joint ventures, and has been a very strong collaboration between clean energy and within the clean energy sector on that front. And the reality is that there's a lot of capital in China to fund these kind of enterprises, a lot more than there is in the U.S. And so you find that a lot of U.S. companies if the dynamics aren't right here, I mean, future fuels notwithstanding, if the dynamics aren't right here, then they'll go to China to look for these experiences. And you see major U.S. multinationals setting up R&D labs in China looking to either jointly develop technology with China or to market their technology in China, because there's actually a market there with substantial long-term incentives and long-term investments. And I would say, like, for example, the Green Gen project that Jake mentioned, I mean, Peabody has a stake in that.
And Duke too? Duke's involved?
I think
a little bit.
Okay.
More advisory.
Yeah. But Peabody has a direct 6% stake in the project, which means that you have U.S. companies that they can't get the IGC CCS demonstration projects getting done in the U.S., so they'll go partner with Chinese, which is SOE backed, so it's essentially a Chinese government backed project in China in order to actually get that experience and develop this technology. So,
yeah. The patient woman in the back. And we're coming to low on time, so we'll try to keep our last couple questions succinct, if you could.
Yeah, hi, my name is Carrie Fulton.
Oh,
And can you hear me? I work with the Environmental Justice and Climate Change Initiative, also with the Energy Action Coalition. So I thank you all for the work that you are doing. I had a couple quick questions. I actually had the opportunity to go to Cancun and also to Cochabamba. And one of the big issues that is definitely relevant to that conversation is the issue of human rights. And how is that integrated into that conversation? Not only on a domestic level when we talk about environmental justice within our policies, but also making sure that the voices of community members are involved in that process, because the Cochabamba Accord was written by the people instead of by five representatives from five countries, like the Copenhagen Accord was. So my question in regards to that is how do you see not only that human rights conversation being integrated into international negotiations, but also into the work of your organization, as well as a question on what do we see are the projected outcomes of the inaction of the U.S. As we talk about, for a long time now, our countries around the world have been acting except for the U.S. So what does that mean for a long-term conversation about, I don't know if the world is going to finance us, but they could obviously find some ways to demonize us and possibly restrict our ability. So what do you all think of that? What does that look like for you all? Human rights and our inaction in general.
Thank you. I'm not sure I got the last part of your question, but I think I got everything before that. You said something about demonizing, and I think I missed that part around that.
Hey, just like Cushing, can you give her the mic that's working? That one's not working.
I don't think it's the mic.
The mic.
I could hear you quite well. I think I just lost attention when I.
Oh, it's okay.
Yeah.
So the question was around the fact that we are not acting, and we are the largest polluter in the world. And so what does that mean for long-term negotiations if we continue to not act?
It doesn't bode well. I don't think it's right that the U.S. isn't acting at all. As I said, the Obama administration is at the executive, to the extent of their executive authority. I think they've done a lot of very good things. I think they have a lot of good people in place who are trying hard and applying their creative minds to it. But until we get legislation, our ability to really demonstrate leadership is going to be very limited. And I'm not even sure that the legislation we had constitutes full leadership internationally, but at least it was going in the right direction. I really think it's hard to do an international comprehensive agreement without U.S. Stronger action in place. And that's one of the reasons why I think that we are now in a period of looking at, rather than the objective of international policy, in my mind, for the next few years, of being a comprehensive, binding international agreement, I think of it more right now as a system, as an international system of cooperation on climate change. It's a little bit lesser of a bar to shoot for, I think. But as I said earlier, in some ways it may lead toward strengthening the institutions at all different levels and around the world that will help provide a more solid foundation for getting a real international agreement in the future. but it is a bit of a step back from the ambition we had going toward Copenhagen. On human rights, were you at the conference earlier this week, Tuesday and Wednesday, on this? I believe there was a climate change and human rights conference earlier this week. I know there was. Some of my colleagues attended. And it's something that's really become a issue of greater attention and priority, I think, for a lot of the NGO community, at least, as you yourself know, but even the more mainstream environmental NGOs who didn't necessarily approach it that much from that perspective, say a decade ago or more. But as we've gotten more into the climate issue and realized that it really is a development issue at its core, we're not going to address climate change well unless we address the core development challenges. And therefore, it takes you directly into the human rights sphere. One of the issues where Jake and I work a lot on is the so-called RED area, reducing emissions from forests, and that because it's so tied to land use and in developing countries and to the populations that occupy land in developing countries, the human rights agenda has become very big within RED, and there's been a lot of attention to the right sort of safeguards to protect local communities and indigenous communities and that sort of thing, and I think that that's led toward what will be a more sound sort of policy on RED than perhaps was first envisioned when people were thinking of how you develop incentive systems for it. But I think all that leads to sounder, better sorts of policy incentives in the long run. It does mean more time and is invested into doing this, and it requires consultation processes at multiple levels, and I was in meetings of the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility this week where that topic captured about half of the overall meeting of how we ensure that adequate consultation is done with local communities in potential RED countries. So it has to be part of the agenda.
Jake, do you want to make any final comment?
I don't have anything astronomical to add to that. I think that the lack of action in the U.S. is not the only, but one of the biggest barriers to getting an international agreement. There's still the other barriers are there's still differences of opinion about where we're headed, what the words binding and treaty mean, and that's still very fundamental. But the fact that the U.S. has huge uncertainty about what it's going to do casts a significant shadow over what we can accomplish both in Cancun and, to be honest, South Africa and even in Rio. I mean, the prospects and the reality of what the energy policy of the U.S. is going to look like are so uncertain. And I think every country, sadly, has learned more about the U.S. legislative process than they ever want to do in their entire life.
The civics exercise.
And I think that they don't really want to do that anymore. We obviously on the human rights issue, we're very strong supporters of ensuring indigenous rights as a part of the RED agenda. And obviously within the U.S. we work a lot with communities throughout the country and trying to deal with local environmental issues as well as on climate front. So that's all I'll add to that.
Duncan's leaping in one last time.
Yeah, sorry. There was one piece that of your comment that I wanted to respond to also. Regarding the Copenhagen Accord, I think you said it was negotiated by 5 countries, and that's not the way I understand it. And in a very technical sense, I think there was somewhere between 26 and 32 countries in the room that agreed to that. I'm sorry, you're right. Initially it was 5, and then it was broadened out to a larger group of around 30 countries or so. And then obviously brought to the floor of the plenary on the fateful last night, and that's where the major divisions came up. But I was there, I watched it, and there were, I think, 5 countries who opposed in the end. But there were also other countries who explicitly said that they weren't in the room, but they were comfortable with the way the representatives of their blocs had negotiated on their behalf. So even though they weren't in the room, they felt that the process had served their interests well enough. Now, not all countries did, and that reflected, going back to the organization problems in Copenhagen that I mentioned earlier, we need an adequate due process to make all countries comfortable with the agreements that are reached. And in Copenhagen, because it was poorly organized, because the formal negotiations collapsed, and it had to be sort of salvaged at the end with this mad rush to try to pull something together, there wasn't adequate time to do consultations. Had that occurred over, say, 2 or 3 days instead of 8 hours or so, maybe that could have happened and it could have incorporated everybody's views enough. So it's important in Cancun and the meetings beyond that we manage the process much better in a way so that countries do feel consulted. I think Jake said earlier, you cannot get all 194 countries in the same room negotiating the document. It's an impossibility, and multilateral negotiations have never worked that way, and that's why there are blocks of countries. They assign representatives to a smaller grouping, and then that's the way negotiations work, and sometimes it gets small, but then it gets broadened out. The important thing that has to happen, but it has to go back out so everybody feels comfortable with the overall agreement, and then they can agree to it. And I think Mexico's really tried to work hard this year to make that happen. But boy, these negotiations need to do that. Now, we've just had a very bright light come onto the international scene, and that's last week that the Convention on Biological Diversity in Nagoya, Japan, was successful in agreeing to a new protocol, the Nagoya Protocol. And that's very promising for those of us who think that multilateral negotiation and agreements are very important for all this. So I'm hoping that Cancun and beyond will have much better process that eventually will lead to more stronger substantive agreements.
And I'll have another meeting later. Get different big dogs from around town to come and talk. Got to, mix it up a bit. So can we thank them all one more time for their comments? And I want to remind you, if you don't know, next week we've got Jonathan Watts. He's for the Guardian newspaper. He is the environmental correspondent for Asia. He has a new book called When a Billion Chinese Jump, and he'll be I've heard he's quite entertaining. It's November 10th at noon, so come by and see us. And if you're new, some of you, I've seen a few new faces here. Make sure you come and give me your card because I like making sure I get you on my mailing list. Thanks again. Yay.